Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hello, how you doing, everybody? It is Friday, October 25th, 2019, getting close to Halloween. Everyone got your costumes together. You have very little time. Not the usual pressure I get from the kids this year to rush out and help them put their costumes together. They're getting older, so I don't know what that means. But, well, we're looking forward to Halloween nonetheless. And, I don't know. I guess that's going to be the show today. Talking about Halloween preparations. I don't think so. Probably something else. Daily Co's Radio now being live. And I guess for a good suggestion on how to start the show, we can always go to Bill's tweet announcing that fact. Kagro X, me, David Waldman, announces he's launching an investigation into the investigation into the investigation of the investigation. I think I got all the correct number of investigations in that one. You've done it now, people. You've made him mad, and something's driving me mad. I am mentally prepared, as always. Yeah, right, for this show. Realized about 5 minutes ago, oh yeah, I have to do a radio show. I should probably get some topics together, which is the usual place in which we begin the show. So anything that comes of this won't be any different than any of the rest of them. Friday, the day to catch up on some of the stories we haven't yet had a chance to get on the air. The tradition I like to stick to, or at least I like to say I need a tradition, in order to pretend like I'm doing something here. And to me, the tradition is try and race through a Friday show and get out all the subjects that you can in case one of them explodes over the weekend. And we've had a relatively good track record of picking some things out. Not every Friday do we pick the story that explodes over the weekend, but it happens with fair frequency. And I don't think it's any special skill. I think it's the volume and intensity of the reporting begins to increase, and so we take notice of it by seeing it circulated in the news or on Twitter or wherever else, and bring it up because we say, hey, this looks like the sort of thing that's going to catch on, and then the rest of the non-news junkie world does indeed catch on in the next couple of days because of the increased volume. I love taking all the magic out of the show, if that's possible. But, we don't want to rely on magic. I think logic usually helps explain things that much better, especially for this audience. So let's see. Without further ado, let's just say things like, without further ado, that make it sound like the next topic we cover has been thoroughly considered and makes sense, logical sense, as the next step in our discussion. It really doesn't make much of a difference. But when you say words like that, it just happens to make people think that you know what you're doing. As a matter of fact, that reminds me of a tweet I saw the other day, which is usually how I start these shows. Josh Barrow, of all people, I thought really caught on to this thing. He was, I don't know why my mind wanders to this one, I guess because of what I just made up a second ago. But he was commenting on Hugh Hewitt's commentary, which is always an easy thing to do and usually a good subject to begin with. There's usually something to dig out of that to make fun of and crack a joke, and that's always a fun way to start the day on Twitter. But let's see, can I find his thing? He was talking about I'll see if I can find his actual tweet, and he was talking about Hugh Hewitt's analysis of something, and I guess he has got a strange proclivity for doing this, and he loves to throw legal terminology out there that makes it sound like he knows what he's talking about, when in fact it may be the case that he has nothing whatsoever to say on the subject. Let me see. I'm not finding it, but I might have Josh Barrow's Twitter handle incorrect. Let's see. No, he's J Barrow. Okay, let's see. So at J Barrow. So anyway, this particular instance for I'm really gonna have to go through his whole timeline here. This is terrific. All right. But Hugh Hewitt was, I forget exactly what it was. I think he was talking about, it was during the discussion in which everyone was slamming the due process idea, saying that Republicans complaining that there wasn't due process afforded during the impeachment hearings that were going on. This, of course, would be the depositions that are taking place, quote unquote, in secret, but in fact just in closed proceedings of these three committees getting together. But let's see. I think if I remember correctly, the terminology that he was throwing out. Now I can't remember what catchphrase he was using. So this has turned out to be a terrible story. But basically he was just pointing out that he's throwing out these terms that only in the most distant sense did they have anything to do with the proceedings that were going on. He was actually using terminology that just really didn't have. It was a genuine legal term. I wonder if I can find it in my own tweets and retweets. But damn, this is annoying. But well, I guess I'll return to it. Maybe during one of the breaks, I'll be able to scrape this thing up. This is hard when you don't set these things aside. I didn't really think I was going to go in this direction. But man, and now I just wanted to try and remember which kind of terminology Hugh Hewitt was using. But it was something that was, again, there it is. Finally. Phew, I found it. So Hugh Hewitt is tweeting about, I don't know what, but the tweet he used is the absurd, rote, almost lockstep anger, here we are, of the left. That would be you and me, I guess. At anyone saying, no, that doesn't prove what you are saying, is what we lawyers call an admission against interest. Obvious cases are, well, obvious. You don't have to shout or throw tantrums, just make arguments, if they exist. I'm not sure what he's reacting to or whether we can tell from that tweet. I don't think so, but I think this is supposed to be, Republicans saying in the hearings that the accusation you're making isn't borne out by the evidence. And when Republicans try and make that point, if Democrats or those among us, those among the left, whether they count themselves as Democrats or not, say that doesn't prove what you're saying, or rather they say that doesn't prove what you're saying, and we get angry and yell at them that it does prove what we're saying, that is an admission against interest. And it's like that is not at all what that term is used for. Admission against interest, as I recall from law school days. I never did bother to actually practice as an attorney, so I may not be as sharp as those who use these terms every day, but my recollection of learning about admissions against interest was as a hearsay exception, which is extraordinarily dumb well to go to for drawing water here, since the other excuse Republicans are constantly using to exclude evidence somehow, or to undermine the power of evidence in the court of public opinion, of all places, the federal rules of evidence, that hearsay should not ordinarily be permitted as evidence in court. And there are several exceptions to that rule, and they're all listed out. And as a first year law student, you're supposed to memorize all of them, and I guess as a practitioner, you're supposed to know what they are too. So that when the other side dramatically says objection, hearsay, you say, well, it's actually an admission against interest, one of 15 exceptions to the hearsay rule. An admission against interest would be, for instance, an admission of the crime. It's against your interests to have admitted that. And so therefore it would be considered, if you're using it as a hearsay exception, it would be considered one of the accepted reasons to admit hearsay evidence, despite the fact that it is hearsay. That's another of the misconceptions. A lot of people think that once you object that something is hearsay, if you can establish that it is in fact hearsay, there is a specific definition, and I think they drummed this into us pretty well in law school. An out-of-court statement offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted, as a complicated way of saying that if you said something or heard someone say something outside of court and someone else is quoting that back, saying this is what I heard said, hearsay, heard said outside of court, somebody says, well, that could be anything. The person who said it should be brought here to testify to it. That would be the preferred method of entering this into the record. But there were several exceptions, some very obvious, some, very esoteric. But an admission against interest. If that person who I'm quoting said something that was an admission against their interest, that would be ordinarily the sort of thing that someone would not usually be caught dead saying, but the fact that they said it means that, why would such a person say something like that in court or out of court at all? That's supposed to give it some additional trustworthiness. A person would not ordinarily be motivated to say such a thing, whereas perhaps the ordinary motivation would be an out-of-court statement that says, I didn't do it, wouldn't necessarily, by itself, without some other exception, be admissible because that person should be brought into court and put under oath and asked whether they did it, and they'll give their answer then. But if they admitted that they did it, that would be out of character, and there would have to be some special reason for them to have said it. And the special reason I guess, is assumed to be, well, it must be true, because otherwise they wouldn't have said it. Why would you lie and say you did something and get yourself in trouble when you didn't? That's, my stupid half-assed recollection of an admission against interest. There are other very stupid esoteric exceptions to the hearsay rule, like for whatever reason, if it was recorded in your family Bible that someone was born on a certain date, and you otherwise offer that that person is 22 years old, that's what I heard. All right, so that's hearsay. Well, for whatever reason, tradition's sake, going way back, we would allow that if a family Bible in which everyone's birth dates are recorded inside the front or back cover, and I don't really know why people began doing that to their family Bibles either, but I mean that's the dumbest, most esoteric exception I can recall off the top of my head. Or ancient documents, and I guess that covers the same thing, and family Bible, the dumb, weird exceptions. Anyway, the point really here is that now that you sort of have an idea of what an admission against interest is, then you will see how stupid it is for Hugh Hewitt to say, well, when a Democrat gets angry because a Republican says that evidence you're bringing up doesn't prove what you're saying, when that Democrat gets angry, that's an admission against interest. I guess what he's trying to say here is that if you have an argument to make about why it does prove what you're saying and that the Republican is wrong, you should make it. But that getting angry is an admission that you don't have a real argument. And so therefore, something. And that's where the logic runs out. Again, to double guess what he's saying, I guess that's by refusing to argue against the argument, you're admitting that you don't have an argument. That's an admission against interest, except, like I said, the chain ends there. At the best, you could say, well, does that mean that you think that it would be admissible evidence in court if a person testified that liberal person doesn't have a real answer to the argument, and I know that because they once got angry at someone else outside of court, and that anger should be admitted as evidence in court that they don't have an answer to the argument, because it's an admission against interest that it's not. That wouldn't even qualify as an admission against interest exception to hearsay. It doesn't prove what he thinks it does, but he's just throwing it out there because it's the sort of thing when he says it's what we lawyers call an admission against interest, even though it's English and you can understand it, and with a little bit of thought and a tiny bit of explanation, even wrong explanation, you can come to understand what an admission against interest is without going to law school. And you would say, that doesn't strike me as the sort of thing that lawyers would call an admission against interest for any reason. Not only because it isn't an admission against interest, but because it also doesn't qualify as that, under that term of art, as a hearsay exception. And no one's saying anything about hearsay, so why are you even saying the combination of words, admission against interest? Josh Barrow happened to notice this, I guess. I don't know whether Josh Barrow himself is a lawyer or just watched a number of legal dramas on television or what. But he points out, Hugh, I think you are confused about law things. For example, if you said, I am Hannity with glasses, that would be an admission against interest. But when you behave like Hannity with glasses, that's just you being a credulous hack. It's not an admission. But I think more to the point was his follow-up tweet, which said, Hugh Hewitt, like this is a dialogue, except there's only one person involved. Brief monologue from Hugh Hewitt, who has just burned a crepe in a pan, and then says, this is what we chefs call ménage à trois. Again, well, he's cooking something French, and he said the thing in French, and I don't speak French, so that must be what chefs call a ménage à trois. It is not, of course. It's a burnt crepe and nothing more, and a ménage à trois is something completely different. But it being French, as is the word crêpe, then I guess that must be enough. And I think that really explained it very well. That brings us nowhere, but a good 15 minutes later into the show. So a good entertainment value to the start of the show, I hope. Did you follow along? Did that make sense? Did you learn anything about the exceptions to the hearsay rule? Did you learn what an admission against interest is? If not, advise your friends to skip the first 15 minutes of the show and move on. All right. That's the warm-up that I needed, I guess, to get my brain moving. Time to switch over to the rest of the tweet thread and everything else I saved for you in Pocket, including some of the long reads that we're going to have to go through prior to the weekend. All right, the hot stuff today. Let's see where to begin. Yesterday, let's see. First of all, I offered you the chance to read the technocratic explanation for why the OMB's blocking of part of the Ukrainian aid was possibly okay under the law, but that other portion of it was not. And I don't know if I believe that the rest of you have actually done this here. Let's see. Oh, look, I've got a weird pop-up. Firefox stopped the social network from tracking you here. How do you like that? That's popped up in Lawfare, of all places. I'd love to read about that, but it's just getting in my way right now. But something to consider. Anyway, as I said, a technocratic explanation of things, which I think we can get through relatively quickly. And if you didn't tune out during the explanation of admission against interest, maybe this will do it. More on the role of OMB withholding in withholding Ukrainian aid is the piece I've got here in front of me from Lawfare by Jacques Singer-Emery, whose name we called the other day, Margaret Taylor, and Jack Goldsmith, whose name is familiar to you. Margaret is a new one for us. And this was a follow-up to an earlier piece that's linked in there. I don't think we actually, from my quick read, I don't think we actually needed to read the earlier piece in order to get the picture here. But I don't know. Sometimes this process stuff turns out to be fascinating. So they write here, Russell Vogt. Remember, this is how all this began. Russell Vogt was tweeting the other day, the acting director, or rather in our sound effects world. Acting. Director of Office of Management and Budget, OMB, announcing on Twitter that he and Michael Duffy, an OMB political appointee, are refusing to be deposed by the House committees pursuing an impeachment investigation. You remember that. With this in the news, it is worth revisiting OMB's delay in releasing nearly $400 million in foreign assistance to Ukraine. In a post on October 16th, the aforementioned linked piece, two of us, there are three writing here, two of us questioned whether OMB satisfied its legal obligations by postponing the release of this assistance. And remember, there are two, we'll call them tranches here because it has to do with money, and everyone loves using the word tranche when it comes to millions of dollars. There was $141 million from the State Department. Remember, I discussed this briefly with Joan, the two sources of the aid here. $141 million from the State Department and $250 million, the bigger chunk, from the Defense Department. Well, in their earlier piece, they say, we concluded that the answer was unclear. Further investigation, that's why we're here, suggests that while the withholding of State Department funds likely did not breach OMB's legal obligations, and remember these guys tend to be somewhat conservative in their legal outlook, the White House's decision to use OMB to hold Defense Department aid appears to have exceeded OMB's authority. Now, how can this be? Anyway, note again that the State Department funding, the smaller chunk, $141 million, might have been legally permissible to withhold. The larger chunk, $250 million from the Defense Department, not so much. During an October 17th press conference, we need our sound effect again. Acting! White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney stated that administration officials withheld the Ukrainian aid in part. You remember this dumb admission against interest, as a matter of fact. That they withheld the Ukrainian aid in part because Trump believed Ukraine was corrupt. Mulvaney argued that Trump did not want to line the pockets of corrupt Ukrainian officials. He wanted to line the pockets of corrupt American officials. Mulvaney also added, did Trump also mention to me in passing the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money. That wasn't a great statement. And he tried walking it back. It hasn't worked so far. Mulvaney's statement regarding the DNC server refers to the president's apparent belief in a conspiracy theory that the DNC server hacked by the Russian government in the lead up to the 2016 election is currently in Ukraine and should be examined. A memorandum summarizing a July 25th call between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Trump indicates that Trump acted on this belief when he asked Zelensky to, quote, find out what happened with the server. If Mulvaney's assertions are accurate, then OMB appears to have withheld the aid for reasons unrelated to the budget. That's their authority. OMB, Office of Management and Budget. So how can OMB withhold money? Reasons related to the budget empower it to do so. So if Mulvaney's assertions are accurate, that it didn't have anything to do with the budget, then we have a problem. OMB appears to have withheld the aid for reasons unrelated to the budget and to have done so without informing Congress. They are, of course, the ones, you remember, that have the purse strings. The OMB is an administrative agency that executes the spending of the money appropriated by Congress. And when they decide that they're going to do something contrary to what Congress has ordered by statute, they need to at least inform Congress that they're doing this so that Congress can either say yay or nay to this exercise of authority. Without assessing the veracity of Mulvaney's claim, although that would seem to be most people's interest in this stuff, right? But they're getting esoteric. They're getting into the weeds. Without assessing the veracity of his claim, this statement is contrary to what relevant law normally requires, which means, of course, that it's a problem all by itself. Whether Mulvaney is telling the truth or not, there's a problem with the legality of OMB delaying this funding, or indeed stealing this funding. That would be a second legal problem. But again, I remind everybody, we have no proof that they actually released the funding that they say they did. All right, but just keep that in the back of your mind. However, they continue, in certain cases, the executive has pockets of discretion based on how Congress has provided the funding. Herein lies the difference between the State Department funding and the Defense Department funding. Mulvaney alluded to this issue in his press conference when he said, there was a report that if we didn't pay out the money, it would be illegal. It would be unlawful. That is one of those things that has a little shred of truth in it. It would be true. In that it makes it look a lot worse than it really is. We were concerned over at OMB about impoundment. The Budget Control Impoundment Act of 1974, which we usually just call the Budget Act here, says that if Congress appropriates money, you have to spend it. And we knew that money either had to go out the door by the end of September, or we had to have a really, really good reason not to do it. And that was the legality of the issue. That's a very simple rendering of it. We have a really, really good reason. And of course, there are specifics about what make things good reasons and what does not. Now back to the article itself, the main body. Mulvaney appears to be asserting that OMB satisfied all of its legal duties in its dealings with the State Department and Defense Department funds. While OMB did release, allegedly, I would add here, the State Department and Defense Department money around September 11th, I say prove it, actions taken prior to this date did not obviously comply with all relevant federal laws. And by the way, the only proof that they offer that the money was released is a New York Times article of October 9th that says, the title being, On Ukraine Aid, Nothing to See Here. Diplomats urged to play down funds release. So in other words, it was a statement to the press by the same people who were already very likely breaking the law by not releasing the money, saying, don't prosecute us. We did not break the law. And even if we did, the money is released, and so leave us alone. There's nothing to see here. And that's all there is to it. Now, I'm sure that there are papers to be signed by way of releasing things and releasing any holds on the money. I haven't seen them. You haven't seen them. Nobody's published them. We assume they exist, but that's all we're doing. And with these guys, I don't think that's always a wise decision. We'll return to this esoteric topic after this break. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal, except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Wouldn't you like to dive back into these weeds? Well, that's what we're going to do here. But I just wanted to reiterate my point that I'm still asking for proof that the money has been released. You would think that the Ukrainians would be complaining loudly, but maybe not. They might be. That's my problem. Is I think they might be just keeping their heads down, no matter what happened, whether they have the funding or not. So. And as always, I want people to produce paperwork for everything that the Trump administration does. Anyway, we left off by saying that Mulvaney's comments in his press conference appear to be asserting that OMB has satisfied all of its legal duties, and that if we accept the assertion that they've released the funds, then what? Well, they continue here. As two of us, again, discussed on October 16th, and they cite the relevant statutory authority here, they wrote that 31 U.S. Code Section 1512 states that OMB must apportion appropriated funds to, quote, prevent obligation or expenditure at a rate that would indicate a necessity for a deficiency or supplemental appropriation for the period. They're responsible for managing that money and parceling it out in ways such that it satisfies its purpose without creating a deficiency at any point. They don't run out of money, if that's possible. Under the same statute, this would be, of course, where their authority comes from for slowing down or delaying the release of money. They have the authority, if the Congress were to say this $100 million project is now funded, the OMB, if for whatever logistical reasons, is able to determine, or through whatever logistical means, is able to determine, well, that money should, instead of being released on the first day of the new fiscal year, if the budget were in fact passed before the beginning of a new fiscal year, which is a rare event these days. But for the sake of argument, we say that if Congress were to complete its budget work on time, such that on October 1st, the first date of a new fiscal year, everything was properly in place, and the OMB this would be the first day that the OMB was entitled to release the $100 million for the project, but the contracts hadn't been signed yet for whatever reason, or there was still some negotiation about it. Whatever it is, if they don't release the money on October 1st, there has to be a reason for it. And sometimes it's simply, well, the contract hasn't been signed yet, so there's no point in releasing the money. And that would be a legitimate exercise of their authority. Or if they determined that something weird was going on and that the contract, for whatever reason, had been concluded and it was going to cost $200 million, but they only had $100 million and they couldn't get the contractor to agree to begin work until the full $200 million was accounted for, the OMB would have some authority to hold on to the money and finish up the negotiations, or whatever reason you can imagine. In other words, in creating OMB, the Congress contemplated that there would be complications with large amounts of money being spent by lots of people for hundreds of thousands of projects, and you have the authority to do the normal things that someone in charge of contracting would do. We don't want to make these decisions part of the budget each time. So, 31 U.S. Code 1512 states that OMB must apportion appropriated funds, properly and assure that there's not going to be any deficiency or no need for supplemental appropriations. Under the same statute, the President or the OMB, via delegation, can withhold money to create a reserve only in order to prepare for budgetary contingencies, achieve savings, or meet the parameters of specific funding laws. Creating such a reserve would require notice to Congress pursuant to the 1974 Impoundment Control Act, not the Budget Control Act, but the Impoundment Control Act. Those of you who remember any presidential history may remember where the Budget and Impoundment Act and the Just Plain Impoundment Control Act came from. This was a constitutional crisis, some constitutional hardball, wherein President Nixon tested things, asserting the authority as president to impound money allocated by Congress and say, we're simply not going to do that project. I disapprove of it, and I'm going to impound that money. It was, I guess they had decided that he didn't, or maybe they hadn't come up with the idea of a line item veto yet. This is sort of an early attempt at a line item veto, or it's the defeat of the impoundment effort. The decision by the Supreme Court that no, the president didn't have executive authority to override specific items in a congressionally adopted and approved budget piece by piece. He either had to accept the budget in its entirety or not, or rather the Congress really had to accept the budget. The president doesn't even sign it, but it had to accept appropriations bills entirely or reject them with a veto. It's a blunt instrument, and you have to be really, really willing to go to the mattresses to use it, vetoing an appropriations bill. You can't simply say, all right, I like everything else except this thing. When that failed, but budget hawks decided that maybe it would be a good idea for the president to be able to exercise similar authority, they came up with the idea of the line item veto. That didn't fly constitutionally either. They've tried a couple other fixes along the way, rescissions and all sorts of mechanisms by which the Congress would be given a second bite at the apple if they agreed with the president's recommendation that the appropriation not go forward. But it all sought to leave appropriations power in the hands of the Congress. Anyway, so the 1974 Impoundment Control Act stepped in the way of that and said that creating such a reserve, withholding the money for whatever reason, would require notice to Congress. That makes good sense, right? Again, Congress has the purse strings. Additionally, the ICA mandates that whenever OMB seeks to edit the budget outside of its 31 U.S. Code Section 1512 granted powers to otherwise, quote, defer budget authority, like by withholding aid to Ukraine, including by, quote, withholding or delaying the obligation or expenditure of budgetary authority, that's this, the president needs to send a message to Congress explaining why. However, budget authority may only be proposed for deferral under the ICA for the limited purpose of budgetary contingencies, achieving savings, or meeting the parameters of specific funding laws, but not for policy reasons. In other words, it was designed to prevent the president from finding a backdoor to impoundment or line item veto policy, right? You can't just simply say, this stuff isn't going to happen because I say so. That's the long and short of it. In this instance, the State Department was not required, as a legal matter, to obtain OMB's approval before submitting a mandated 15-day notification to Congress and releasing the $140 million in aid. Again, right? Okay, so for the State Department's allocation, the $141 million, no obligation to obtain OMB's approval before submitting a mandated 15-day notification to Congress and releasing the money. From what we understand, in these types of instances, the State Department usually waits for OMB's informal approval before submitting the required notification to Congress as a courtesy to the White House. In other words, the appropriations bill empowers the State Department to submit a notification to Congress and says, look, we, as the State Department controlling this money, release this aid. They have to say so. They have to tell Congress. We never hear about it because it's routine. It's expected. They were supposed to release that money. But the State Department, I guess, has its ability to move its money more or less on its own say-so once it's appropriated. And they only notify the OMB. That is, the OMB's only role in this is they receive notification, along with Congress, from the State Department that, look, State Department says we were entitled to this money and we're taking it and we're moving it. The OMB has no ability to get in the way ordinarily. But I guess if the State Department is ordered not to spend it by the president, then the OMB has no role in that either, and it wouldn't rest on the OMB's shoulder necessarily if that money was delayed. It would be the State Department. I guess that's at fault there. So, where were we with this? Yes, from what we understand, in these types of instances, the State Department usually waits for OMB's informal approval before submitting the required notification to Congress, only as a courtesy to the White House. Here it appears that OMB withheld this informal approval, but during this time, the State Department could have unilaterally sent Congress a notification and released this aid. As a result, the White House likely met its legal obligation with this section of the funds because it was not formally responsible for the delay, and OMB did, ultimately, they say, apportion the funds before the fiscal year's end. That's just an assertion. It is purportedly true. I don't know that it was really true, but that's what everyone's claiming. Now, what about the Defense Department? By contrast, it seems OMB was likely using its formal power to delay the release of Defense Department aid. OMB appears to have extended the release timeline on these funds by revising an existing apportionment to add footnotes that effectively made the money legally unavailable until its release sometime around September 11th, allegedly. As the October 16th post pointed out, this apportionment process, including any applicable footnotes, I guess they actually mean real, honest-to-God footnotes in a memo of some kind, is legally binding and is outlined in Section 120 of OMB's Circular A11 document. I don't know what that is. It is linked here, but we'll move on because I don't think that's necessary to explain exactly what that is. Ambassador William Taylor's testimony revealed that after OMB placed a hold on the aid, OMB asked the Defense Department to conduct an effectiveness study. I guess OMB realized right away, well, we might not really have this authority. However, we know that we're allowed to withhold funds, at least temporarily, if there are budgetary problems that could arise from the release of it. So they direct the Defense Department to conduct an effectiveness study, hoping that the effectiveness study will be the crutch they can lean on to point to the sorts of budgetary issues that would ordinarily entitle OMB to delay the release of the funding. So they go ahead and direct the Defense Department to conduct one. The Defense Department, though, completed the study one day after the OMB request and concluded that the aid would be effective. What does that tell you? That tells you that the Defense Department knew right away that the OMB was looking for cover and did not want to provide it. OMB says, well, maybe this money wouldn't be effective. That's a way we could impound it. That's a way we could prevent it from being released. It wouldn't be effectively spent. After all, we all think that Ukraine is thoroughly corrupt. So it wouldn't be effective to give them money because it would all be stolen by corrupt officials, right, Defense Department? But the Defense Department knew right away what was going on and said, all right, fine, we're supposed to study the thing. We just studied it. Guess what we concluded? It would be effective. Now send it. They're exercising every bit of their authority, saying, look, it's up to us to determine whether or not it would be effective, and it's up to us to determine how we would determine whether it would be effective. We're using every bit of our authority and simply declaring that it would be, and there's really no opportunity for you to appeal that decision, so just shut up and release the money already. That's the way the Defense Department approached things. I guess they didn't get the memo from the president. The Defense Department completed the study in one day and concluded the aid would be defective, yet Taylor's testimony asserts OMB continued to hold the aid. Something's wrong here. In this instance, if OMB was merely conducting a budget audit to ensure Ukrainian aid was appropriately apportioned, not appropriately spent, but appropriately apportioned, like was this really done correctly in Congress, questioning the Appropriations Committee, I guess, these actions would have been within its mandate. Furthermore, OMB would have had a plausible argument that the ICA, which you can find if you're interested in looking it up, at 2 U.S. Code Section 683A. The ICA allows the office to delay the Defense Department's aid in order to determine how it should be apportioned. Okay. I guess if there's insufficient direction in what to do with the aid or how it should be, as they say, how it should be apportioned, how much should they get, when should they get it, for what should it be used, etc. However, to date, there is no evidence that this was the reason for the delay. The apportionment was fine. It was pretty specific, and everyone knew what the money was to be used for. Perhaps some such evidence will emerge, but all of the information in the public realm thus far, including what Mulvaney said on October 17th, indicates that the reasons for the delay had nothing to do with a budget audit. Instead, the delay concerned, at most, pressure to get the Ukrainians to open an investigation in order to help the president politically, and possible policy concerns about corruption, maybe. On our reading of the relevant laws, this is not a valid basis for OMB to delay the release of funds. On September 27th, the president signed into law a 7-week continuing resolution that included a provision extending the availability of the Defense Department's unspent Ukraine funds. Because the life of the funds was extended, the White House avoided effectively rescinding appropriated funding without congressional approval, which would have been a blatant impoundment violation under the relevant laws, including the ICA and the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act and the 2019 Appropriations Act, all the budgetary authority for the Ukrainian aid. I mean, that was more window dressing than we really needed, just to say it would be illegal. But you see what happened here? Because the life of the funds was extended with a continuing resolution, there was no longer the threat that at the end of the fiscal year, because the money was unspent, it disappears. There's no longer any authorization to release it, which may or may not have been the aim of the White House at the time. Anyway, but it appears that the OMB did not comply with relevant law when it delayed the release of the Defense Department's $250 million in aid on grounds unrelated even to the permissible reasons for proposing such a delay under the ICA, budgetary contingencies, savings through greater efficiency, or the need to meet the parameters of specific funding laws, right? So a very detailed explanation, and I always appreciate a good detailed explanation, because sometimes if you leave out the nuances of things that could happen along the way, and then one of those weird things that rarely happens does happen along the way, it makes it seem like it was misreported all along, when it wasn't. It was just simply glossed over, which I guess you could count as a reporting error. But I always appreciate being able to go back and find out what these things are. So what these guys have done is they laid out every possible reason where under which the OMB would have been within its authority to withhold the money. They concluded that there might actually be authority to withhold the State Department portion of the money, but not the Defense Department portion of the money. And that the extension of the adoption of the continuing resolution gets us past the problem of the money disappearing on September 30th if it's unspent, but it still doesn't satisfy the requirements of the OMB. This money was apportioned by Congress. Your only job is making sure that it is efficiently and properly sent out the door. There's very little authority, absent budgetary reasons in particular, to allow OMB to close the door on anything. OMB is supposed to have an open back door, and all the money is supposed to simply flow out of it in an orderly fashion. There are very limited circumstances under which you can close the back door, and they didn't have those, or didn't even bother to assert that they had those. They made an attempt, I guess, to get the DOD to play ball, but they wouldn't do it. And so I guess that pretty much closes the book on this thing. OMB violated the law, and now those officials who facilitated that violation of the law have refused a non-binding request for their deposition. They will shortly, if not already, have been subpoenaed for that information, and whether or not they go along with defying the subpoenas, we will see. So far, other personnel inside of the administration and other branches have not, but the OMB might really be closely held under the Trumpian or Mulvaney's thumb. We'll see how long Mulvaney's loyalty to the administration lasts, or whether any of his underlings think that they're likely to get pardoned or even be represented in court by government lawyers, or lawyers that they don't have to pay for anyway, if they decide to obey the president and continue to defy the subpoenas. I hope that cleared a few things up for you, and you're certainly smarter for having heard this, and you'll be somewhat conversant, I think, and at least you'll be able to refer to the article if you need to in the middle of your conversations over the weekend about the legalities surrounding the refusal to release the Ukrainian funds. And then you might as well tell them that you also don't believe that they were ever released anyway, because you don't believe that the Trump administration can handle its own paperwork. And if they don't show you the paperwork, you should never believe anything that they say if it is an admission in their own interest. Right? Now, if they admit against interest, you can take that to the bank, I guess. But I would double check anything that they say. All right, other topics that require some discussion. I mentioned to you yesterday that there would have to be some discussion of a new figure in the Trump orbit that I think might break into the wider news over the next couple of days. I was comparing them to Parnas and Fruman in that to Parnas and Fruman in that sense. We may start hearing more about Kashyap Patel, the main author of the secret memo, whatever secret memo that is no stranger to quarrels. This, according to the New York Times, a piece from, some time ago. Actually, this is one that, I guess one of the additional pieces that I was referred to after putting away a story on him in that's more recent. Here we go. Another New York Times thing. And I guess I read that piece and they referred to this older piece about Kashyap Patel. So here we go. I got to start over here, closer in time today. This is the October 23rd piece, not the February 2018 piece on Kash Patel. So they've been trying to get us to pay attention to this guy for some time, and it hasn't worked. But maybe now it will. Here we are. Sorry. So strike all that, reverse it. White House aides feared that Trump had another Ukraine back channel. That was actually the headline that grabbed my attention. I didn't know it was about Kash Patel until I got to the subheader, which says senior national security officials grew concerned about Kash Patel, a colleague who had been involved in Republicans' efforts to undermine the Russia investigation. You see, he turns up at every problem spot. So we better learn about who this guy is. Now, the current piece, October 23rd, written by Julian Barnes, Adam Goldman, and Nicholas Fandos, says this: when Kashyap Patel was an aide to the House Intelligence Committee in the first years of the Trump administration, he played a key role in helping Republicans try to undermine the Russia investigation, writing a memo that accused law enforcement officials of abusing their power. Important story. That one's definitely blowing up over the weekend as people are talking about the emergence of a criminal investigation in the DOJ into the opening of the Russia investigation. An important transformation and troubling transformation of what Barr and is it Dunham? I can't remember the name of the U.S. attorney from Connecticut who is helping him out in that. But anyway, that investigation into, well, how did this Russia thing get started anyway, has transformed from a we just want to know into an actual criminal investigation, which I hope we can get to a little bit later. All right. So reminder, though, that again, Ukraine and Russia, difficult to separate. Kashyap Patel comes up now in the Ukraine context, but he's in position to come up now in the Ukraine context. He's doing things to try and cover tracks in Ukraine because he's the guy they used to try to cover tracks with Russia originally. He's popping up everywhere. The memo, which consumed Washington for weeks, was widely dismissed as a biased argument of cherry-picked facts. But it galvanized President Trump's allies and made Mr. Patel a hero among them. In other words, he was the guy originating or consolidating all of the various conspiracy theories that had to be invented in order to make it look like Trump was innocent and the Democrats were the ones really colluding with the Russians to steal the election, even though they didn't actually manage to steal it somehow. So that's what made Patel the hero. He's like the insider's Sean Hannity, the guy who's willing to put out there this nonsense theory that they can all latch onto and point to and say, well, that's an official theory now. It's been written. So anyway, after Republicans ceded control of Congress this year, he landed on Mr. Trump's National Security Council staff. Lost his job because, of course, in the minority, the House minority has a lot less staff slots available, and I guess he just wasn't that important to them, besides which they had a new place to park him that would allow him to even more access to inject his conspiracy theories into the mainstream. The National Security Council. Colleagues there initially questioned the role of Mr. Patel, who took few notes in meetings and had little expertise for his initial portfolio, which covered the United Nations. Within months, senior White House officials began to suspect he had won Mr. Trump's ear and had effectively created a back channel to the president that could warp American policy, according to congressional testimony and interviews. So that was a suspicion early on. And then, voila, later on, somehow, magically, United States policy towards Ukraine was indeed warped. And golly, if his fingerprints weren't actually on it. Now, a little bit further back in time here. Colleagues grew alarmed after hearing that Mr. Trump had referred to Mr. Patel as one of his top Ukraine policy specialists, and that the president wanted to discuss related documents with him, according to people briefed on the matter. Here I would draw a parallel to George Papadopoulos and Carter Page, whose names came up in the campaign, during the 2016 campaign, when people said, who are your foreign policy advisors, Mr. Trump? And he had no idea because he didn't have any. And he said, somebody handed him, what was the guy's name? I can't remember. The fixer who did this, and wasn't Michael Cohen. The other guy, Sam, what's his name? I don't know why I'm blanking on names today. Anyway, they handed him an index card. Your foreign policy team is Carter Page and George Papadopoulos. George Papadopoulos. I'm sure he mispronounced that. Anyway, this is a little similar. Like, people are, who's George Papadopoulos? Who's Carter Page? Who are these guys? These are nobodies. Nobody in the foreign policy circles have ever heard of him. Well, here, Kashyap Patel. Who's your top Ukraine aide? Kashyap Patel. The people who know about Ukraine are like, we never heard of this guy. So alarm bells ring. Mr. Patel sought to discuss allegations of surveillance abuses by law enforcement officials with Mr. Trump. An administration official said, does that sound familiar? The spying on Trump Tower. Remember, that involves Carter Page too. Interesting. Mr. Patel, who is known as Kash, which is short for Kashyap, is now assigned to work on counterterrorism issues, not Ukraine. So, a surprise for everybody for a lot of reasons. Any involvement by Mr. Patel in Ukraine issues would signal another attempt by Mr. Trump's political loyalists to go around American policymakers to shape policy toward Kiev. It was separate, two of the people said, from the irregular, informal channel led by the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and Gordon Sondland, the American ambassador to the European Union, that is the subject of House Democrats' impeachment investigation. So yet another, second, back channel. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Sam Clovis was the name of the guy I was trying to think of, the guy who arranged for all of this. By the way, I just went quickly to Google to check that out, and I said, okay, George Papadopoulos and then just Sam. I know that name will come up. His definitely first name was Sam. This is interesting. The top hit here is a November 2nd, 2017 Washington Post article. Who's who in the George Papadopoulos court documents? And you know how it has a couple of, I guess it has basically the text surrounding the appearance of your search terms in the blurb. I'm curious about what this has to say. Former Trump campaign advisor George Papadopoulos pleaded guilty in early ... as they say, instead of just saying ellipsis. But the next bit of text that comes up is Victoria Tensing, an attorney for Sam Clovis, confirmed that, and it just struck me like, oh my God, Tensing in this again. DeGeneva and Tensing, attorneys for Sam Clovis, as well as attorneys for Dmitry Firtash, as well as Lev Parnas, and I don't know whether Fruman also has them as their representation. That's an office that needs to be raided, basically, is what I'll tell you right now. The papers being held in the, wherever they are, in the DeGeneva and Tensing offices are, I'm sure, key to unraveling an enormous portion of this. Where does she pop up in this? I don't know if she has a major role in any of this, but now I'm going to scroll through this and see if I can find out where Tensing pops up and see what else is around here. I know this is a bit of a distraction, but I wonder if it'll unlock some of the secrets here and help us make sense of this. Everybody's in this article, of course. Mifsud, Clovis, Papadopoulos, Manafort, Lewandowski, and now I realize Victoria Tensing as well. Where does this come up? She may just have one mention in here, so I think I might have missed it in my scrolling. But okay, if it doesn't pop up right away, we can live with that. We'll return instead to the original story, or the second story of Kash Patel here. Where were we? Yes. So he gets somehow roped into the Ukraine circles by Trump, mostly because he's, I guess, as a successor to his memo about Russia and the whole thing, and Trump-Russia being a hoax, he's moved on to saying, well, this might be the origin of the theory that, all the things that I wove together to claim that the Russia story was a hoax can be salvaged. I don't have to rewrite anything new if I just append up to the top here. What really happened is all the things that everybody suspected Russia of doing, which I said they didn't do because Ukraine actually was the one that did it, and then I don't even have to rewrite my memo. And that somehow moves this weirdo from the House Intelligence Committee to the National Security Council, but given a portfolio for the United Nations because the Ukraine portfolio was taken. And then eventually, but we have to get this guy on a payroll somewhere. But you just do all your work about Russia and maybe if you want to, Ukraine as well. I guess he then writes his Russia memo or transforms his Russia memo into something to do with Ukraine, and the president says, you know what, from now on, you're on Ukraine instead. That's how he gets planted there. Friends of Mr. Patel dismissed the concerns among senior national security officials as conspiracy theories, of all things, by Mr. Trump's critics. The White House declined to comment. House impeachment investigators are scrutinizing Mr. Patel's actions as well, the People said. The investigators have asked witnesses about Mr. Patel and are trying to determine any role he played in the shadow foreign policy Mr. Trump was conducting as he pushed the Ukrainian government to incriminate his political rivals by announcing investigations into them. The contents of the documents were not clear, nor was it clear how Mr. Trump got them. Typically, aides prepare policy briefings for presidents that several agencies sign off on in a highly controlled process. I'll just add, that's a process to make sure that they do everything they can to prevent the president from getting unvetted or very stupid and, baseless information and reciting it aloud, which would have ordinarily significant policy implications in the United States and around the world. The interagency process makes sure that as many agencies as have authority here sign off on this and that the president isn't speaking out of turn. Right? But Mr. Trump has adopted a much more freewheeling approach. We're sort of normalizing this, but taking in unverified information from sources both inside and outside the White House and seeking out and promoting assertions that fit his narrative. Just to tie it to a longer narrative, it was an enormous problem when we discovered the stovepiping issue. When Jane Meyer, when she wrote her article in the New Yorker about how Dick Cheney was insisting on changes in the supply chain of information from the intelligence community to the White House, insisting on unvetted, unreviewed, unanalyzed raw intelligence, that should immediately come directly to him without going through the intelligence community for analysis by people who know what's going on and have a real background in this area. He just wanted the stuff that he could cherry pick to fit his narrative, and what an enormous problem that was. Well, as evil as Dick Cheney was, I don't think anybody thought he was a bumbling idiot the way Donald Trump is, and not quite as susceptible to conspiracy theories, but clearly susceptible nonetheless. Anyway, I think we'd all agree that it's even more dangerous to give stupid information, particularly when it's known to be stupid at the outset, to Donald Trump. So, but an obvious progression from the George W. Bush administration normalizing the idea of going around outside channels, and then the Trump administration being normalized in its stupid, carrying of this nonsense process even further. All right, back to the article again. Fiona Hill, the National Security Council's former senior director for Eurasian and Russian affairs, testified, as you know, to House investigators last week that she believed Mr. Patel was improperly becoming involved in Ukraine policy and was sending information to Mr. Trump, some of the people said. Ms. Hill grew alarmed earlier this year when an aide from the White House Executive Secretary's office told her that Mr. Trump wanted to talk to Mr. Patel and identified him as the National Security Council's Ukraine director, a position actually, I didn't use the word actually here, I'm going to add it, a position actually held by one of Ms. Hill's deputies. The aide said Mr. Trump wanted to meet with Mr. Patel about documents he had received on Ukraine. And remember, the White House Executive Secretary's office is the one with the task of preparing papers to be brought to the president's desk and removing them from the president's desk once processed. So they are the paperwork flow control people. So this person in this office tells Fiona Hill that Trump wants to talk to Patel, and that Trump says that Patel is the NSC's Ukraine director, and one of the few people in the world in a position to know offhand, off the top of her head, that that's not true, is Fiona Hill, to whom this is being told. So, Ms. Hill responded by asking who Mr. Patel was. Well, I just told you he's the Ukraine director. No, I know who the Ukraine director is. Who is this guy? While the aide from the executive secretary's office did not state explicitly that Mr. Patel sent the Ukraine documents to Mr. Trump, Ms. Hill understood that to be the implication, according to a person familiar with her testimony. Mr. Patel's apparent communications with the president prompted Ms. Hill to raise concerns with her superiors, including John Bolton, then the National Security Advisor, that Mr. Patel was meddling outside his portfolio, like Sondland. As early as May, Ms. Hill had begun discussing with colleagues her concerns about whether Mr. Patel was running a shadow effort on Ukraine at the White House, according to 4 people briefed on the discussions. So they think there are several shadow operations on Ukraine. 2 other witnesses in the impeachment investigation, Mr. Sondland and George Kent, another State Department official, testified that they had not encountered him in their work, according to people familiar with the inquiry. They never run into it. So there's at least 2 shadow operations going on here. Mr. Patel joined the National Security Council in February and began getting involved in Ukraine matters in April, as Mr. Giuliani pushed the Ukrainian government to discredit evidence against Paul Manafort, Mr. Trump's former campaign chairman. It was not clear who hired him. Going to say that again. Patel joined the NSC in February, began getting involved in Ukraine matters in April, just at the same time as Giuliani was pushing the Ukrainian government not to investigate Biden, but to discredit the evidence against Manafort. And no one knows why he was doing that, because he has never said Manafort was his client. Mr. Patel was previously best known as the lead author of the politically charged memo released early last year, accusing the FBI and Justice Department leaders of abusing their power in the early stages of the Russia investigation, which brings us to the other article we need to read. Mr. Patel worked at the time as an investigator for the House Intelligence Committee under Representative Devin Nunes of California, who ran the panel when Republicans had control of the chamber. Mr. Patel's efforts to discredit the Russia investigation made him a minor celebrity in conservative circles, but a divisive figure on Capitol Hill. Sort of like the Stephen Miller of Ukraine policy. Just a young staffer who was willing to just blather and make crap up in a memo, but make crap up that was appealing to Trump in particular, and Trump just elevated him out of nowhere because he was telling him what he wanted to hear. As an Intelligence Committee aide, Mr. Patel helped investigate the theory that Ukrainians were responsible for spreading information about Russia's interference in the 2016 presidential election. Mr. Trump has returned to the accusation of Ukrainian meddling repeatedly in public and private conversations. On the National Security Council, Mr. Patel first worked with officials in a directorate called International Organizations and Alliances. that was devoted to advancing American interests at the United Nations and on human rights and other international issues. Too boring, I think, for him, though. Some National Security Council aides questioned whether Mr. Patel's experience as Mr. Nunes' investigator was relevant to overseeing American policy toward the United Nations, a person familiar with his hiring said. Under Mr. Bolton's watch, Mr. Patel was later given a more senior role in the Counterterrorism Directorate. That fit more directly with his background as a one-time federal counterterrorism prosecutor, but some officials said Mr. Patel was promoted to a senior director position unusually quickly. That raises alarms by itself. By the way, I don't think I'm going to get a chance to read the other article, the earlier February 2018 article about Kash Patel, but that article is very revealing in things that are only briefly mentioned here. That his working in the Counterterrorism Directorate fit more directly with his background as a one-time federal counterterrorism prosecutor. The other article, which I'll link I'll give to Scott the link in our daily recap, will explain what's not explained here, I think, unless they get into it later on, that Patel was highly suspect as a counterterrorism prosecutor as well, and did some things that are amazingly inappropriate that would lead you to question, like you do with Michael Cohen and Rudy Giuliani. Did this guy really get a law degree anywhere? Are you sure he's passed the bar and isn't just a hoaxster? So wait till you read that one. I wish we could have more time to read that. Who knows? Maybe we'll get... well, we're not going to if I continue like this, though. Back to the article. Mr. Patel is closely aligned on the National Security Council staff with another alumnus of Mr. Nunes' committee, Michael Ellis, now a top White House lawyer. Mr. Ellis worked for Mr. Nunes for years as a lawyer on the House Intelligence Committee and helped champion Mr. Patel's work on the staff, a person familiar with their roles said. Mr. Ellis, in case that rings a bell for you, was involved in another bizarre episode early in the Trump administration in which he and another White House lawyer printed highly classified reports to show Mr. Nunes, who used them to accuse Obama administration officials of spying on Mr. Trump and his associates. Those claims quickly unraveled, and Mr. Nunes eventually recused himself from his committee's own Russia investigation as a result. So good legal work there, Michael Ellis. Mr. Patel's role as an investigator for Mr. Nunes is highlighted in a book by Lee Smith, a conservative journalist, set to be published next week. The book asserts without evidence that the so-called deep state of career government bureaucrats, and I mean, why isn't Mr. Patel considered a career government bureaucrat? He's bouncing from bureaucratic job to bureaucratic job. And members, but again, the deep state, career bureaucrats and members of the news media as well now, embarked on a grand scheme to thwart Mr. Trump from being president. So, very interesting. So he features in this book that'll only make him more of a hero. By the way, when they mentioned that Ellis is now a top White House lawyer, I don't think this is the case, but it was, who was the lawyer that they got to sign the "This is Bananas" letter to the House committees asserting that the impeachment inquiry was unconstitutional? I was just wondering if that happened to be Mr. Ellis as well. I know it wasn't. I don't think they actually got the White House counsel himself to sign that one, but my recollection may be faulty on that. We'll double check that at some point. Mr. Nunes hired Mr. Patel because he, quote, knew the nature of the enemy, Mr. Smith wrote. That would be the conservative journalist who wrote the book. I hired him to bust down doors, Mr. Nunes said in the book. And he does do that sort of thing. And I guess that's detailed in the other article that I probably won't get a chance to read. You should look at that one. The memo that Mr. Patel wrote as a House Intelligence Committee aide focused on the FBI's use of a dossier of explosive unverified claims about Mr. Trump that Christopher Steele, former British spy, compiled in 2016. You know all about that. House Republicans long ago seized on the dossier as evidence that the Russia investigation was tainted to little avail. As part of their inquiry, House Republicans looked into whether Mr. Steele relied on sources from Ukraine for his research and whether the former American ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, had ties to the research firm that hired Mr. Steele. I think a detail probably since discredited and therefore left out of the stories more recently about Yovanovitch. They came up with other reasons to try to get rid of her, but I guess what might have put her on the radar first is that it was their made-up rumor that Yovanovitch had talked to Steele and given him these rumors about Trump. Maybe that was the Ukrainian source of all this, or perhaps it was asserted that she had heard such things from Ukrainian people and passed them on. Ms. Yovanovitch was a casualty of Mr. Giuliani's efforts in Ukraine as well. She was recalled from her post in the spring as Mr. Trump became convinced she had disparaged him, a charge she denies. Mr. Nunes, Mr. Patel's former boss, has long accused her of speaking out against the president. And I don't know whether that's on a separate incident or whether their fear was that she spoke out against the president to Christopher Steele, because it's never really detailed in the more recent articles who she was bad-mouthing the president to. If the theory is that she was a Steele source, but they're gun-shy on going back to the well of criticizing the Steele dossier, they might just simply say, well, she's talking to some people. And that's bad enough. Anyway, the article actually concludes here. Ms. Yovanovitch has said that one of her bosses told her she was being ousted even though she had done nothing wrong, according to her testimony. So that's the conclusion of this article. I think now the place to jump over to, it makes more logical sense to read you the story from February 2018 about Kash Patel. Maybe we can actually fit that in there, and we'll just have to run through it real quick and then save the last half hour for what I think is the next segment that has to be included, the expansion of the DOJ's investigation into the origins of the Russia investigation. Bill told you I was going to be investigating the investigation of the investigations, right? Kashyap Patel, main author of Secret Memo, is no stranger to quarrels. And this is from, again, back in February of 2018. Katie Rogers and Matthew Rosenberg wrote this piece, and they should be brought into consultation with the people who wrote the piece from Thursday or Wednesday, I think. And they should all get into a war room together and figure out what's going on. Kashyap Patel is, allegedly, I would say, a lawyer who has sometimes run afoul of the rules. Can you believe it? As a lawyer in Florida, so yes, Florida man responsible for all of this in the end. But Florida seems to be a big source for this. That's where Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman are from too. So it's all happening in Florida. But you know how it is with Florida man. As a lawyer in Florida, Mr. Patel, 37, so I guess he's about 38, 39, possibly now, entered and then dropped out of a charity bachelor auction. Who cares, right? Featuring some colleagues after a blogger pointed out that his license to practice in the state appeared out of date. That is pretty weird, don't you think? What a petty situation, but just sort of setting the stage for what's going on. He's a lawyer in Florida, and he's in a charity bachelor auction, I guess, among lawyers for whatever reason, and somebody says, hey, he might not actually be licensed to practice in this state. Curious. Paperwork, man. It's all about paperwork. In 2016, I guess, irrespective of this problem, and maybe we should, I don't know, we don't have time to read the blog write-up about it and see how certain the person is about the paperwork being out of date. Anyway, moving on, in 2016, as a counterterrorism prosecutor, remember that? For the Justice Department. So again, this guy bounces around all over the place. Department of Justice, counterterrorism, House Intelligence Committee investigator, National Security Council in the White House, et cetera, but everybody else is the deep state, you see. In 2016, as a counterterrorism prosecutor for the Justice Department, he was berated by a federal judge, who then issued an order on ineptitude directed at the entire agency. Thanks a lot, Patel. You got the whole agency hit with an order of ineptitude. It's linked if you want to read it. And over the summer, in a trip arranged outside official channels, he traveled to London. And now you'll remember him. and now you'll remember and understand his fixation with Steele. He was the guy who was sent to London, where he tried, unsuccessfully, to meet with Christopher Steele, the author of the dossier that purported, here they use purported, to detail links between the Trump campaign and Russia, according to multiple people with knowledge of the trip. He was sent by Nunes. Do you all remember that there was this abortive attempt to try to, where Nunes said in the last piece that I use him to kick down doors? He was actually trying to, force his way into meeting with Steele. After less than a year as a Republican staff member on the House Intelligence Committee, Mr. Patel has found himself in the middle of another controversy. According to congressional sources, he is the primary author of the politically charged memo released on Friday, remember this is back in February of last year, by the committee chairman, Representative Devin Nunes, over the opposition of the FBI and the intelligence community that accuses federal officials of bias against President Trump. And that figures in today's news, if we ever get to it. Democrats, led by Representative Adam B. Schiff, ever heard of him? The ranking minority member at the time on the committee, were scathing in their criticism of both the report and the decision to release it to the public. The president's decision to publicly release a misleading memo attacking DOJ and FBI is a transparent attempt to discredit these institutions and undermine Mueller's probe, Mr. Schiff said on Twitter on Friday, referring to, guess what, Robert S. Mueller III, the special counsel investigating Russia's involvement in the 2016 presidential election. There's the 10% of the New York Times article explaining what everyone knows. Damon Nelson, the committee's staff director, said in an emailed statement that no single member was responsible for the memo and that its creation was a team effort that involved investigators who had access to the source material. The clamor to identify an author is indicative of an alarming trend by opponents of our investigation, Mr. Nelson said, which is to promote spurious allegations against committee, it says embers, but I'm sure they meant members, and staff. They will not impact the committee's focus and commitment to continue this investigation. But he praised Mr. Patel, saying, "We value Kash's dedication and his contributions to the committee's oversight efforts." Mr. Patel, who did not respond to a request for comment for this article, grew up in Garden City, New York. So you're not responsible for him, Florida, but you have him now. And graduated from the University of Richmond in 2002. So I guess I'm partially responsible as well. He earned a certificate in international law from the University College London Faculty of Laws, according to his Facebook page. I don't know. And graduated from Pace University's law school in 2005. He spent part of his career in the Miami area as a federal public defender in Florida before surprising his coworkers there by taking a job at the Justice Department in 2014, according to his Facebook profile, if it's true. In early 2016, during a court appearance in Houston, Mr. Patel found himself in the crosshairs of Judge Lynn N. Hughes of Federal District Court, who became incensed that Mr. Patel had used the internet credentials of another lawyer to give notice that he would be involved in a terrorism case, and then did not like how he was dressed. So he came dressed like Vinny Gambini in My Cousin Vinny. I guess. I don't know how he would. But what does that really happen in real life? You show up and the judge is angry about how you're dressed. I mean, what do you have to do to get that to happen? And I imagine that's just added on to he used another lawyer's credentials. What? Why? How? I mean, maybe the other blogger was right. The guy never had a license to practice law. And now he's somehow bounced from being a federal public defender, which is problematic all by itself, to a Justice Department counterterrorism prosecutor who doesn't even own a suit, as far as I can tell. I don't know. The last thing I need here, Mr. Patel, the judge said, according to the transcript of the hearing, is a bureaucrat, who flies down here at great expense and causes trouble rather than actually is a productive member of the team. Weird, huh? I guess he's deep state after all. After working on counterterrorism cases at the Justice Department, inexplicably, because he's not using his own credentials, Mr. Patel joined the Intelligence Committee last spring. Again, that would be in 2017, as a senior staff member, despite all of this, and has been at the forefront of Mr. Nunez's inquiry into whether the FBI and the Justice Department, where he just came from, abused the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Over the summer, Mr. Nunez dispatched Mr. Patel and another member of the committee's Republican staff to London, where they showed up unannounced at the offices of Mr. Steele, a former British intelligence official. Told Mr. Steele was not there, Mr. Patel and Douglas E. Presley, a professional staff member, managed to track him down at the office of his lawyers. There, they said they were seeking only to establish contact with Mr. Steele, but were rebuffed and left without meeting him, according to two people with knowledge of the encounter. I remember that story. I didn't connect his name with it necessarily, but we'll tell you the rest of this weird saga after this break, and then finally connect it to today's news that you'll need to know for the weekend. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We pick up again with the backgrounder from back in February of 2018 on Kashyap Patel, the man at the center of the news that led to today's news, which we still haven't gotten to yet. But as we left off, we found out that it was Patel and Doug Presley who were semi-infamously, I guess, dispatched to London by Devin Nunes to try and somehow do something, intercept Chris Steele, and I don't know, question him. I'm not certain what they attempted to do, but it was a big failure all the way around, and we didn't make much of a big deal of it then because it was a big failure. It was just sort of surprising, shocking news, and another example of how crazy Devin Nunes really was. But now we're going to find out how crazy other people around him were. A senior official for the Republican majority in the Intelligence Committee, who spoke on condition of anonymity back then, because he was not authorized to speak about the matter, said the purpose of the visit had been to make contact with Mr. Steele's lawyers, not Mr. Steele, which is, of course, why they went to Mr. Steele's office first and asked for Mr. Steele, but then found out he was at the lawyer's office and then went to speak to them, and they said no to that, too. I don't know what this is supposed to mean, that they're trying to pretend that it was about talking to his lawyers, because that didn't work either, and it doesn't make any sense based on what they actually did. Still, the visit was highly unusual and appeared to violate protocol. Another violation of protocol? What? Because they were trying to meet with Mr. Steele outside official channels. Ordinarily, such a visit would be coordinated through lawyers, especially if you were trying to contact the lawyers. Conducted with the knowledge of House Democrats, who were not informed, and the American Embassy. In the months since, Mr. Patel has apparently forged connections in the White House. And I stress that, even though it's a different meaning of the word forged, but I just want to plant that in your mind. The guy's credentials are never in order. He uses someone else's credentials when he goes to court. Even in a bachelor auction, they apparently spot that his credentials are out of date. And now he's forging something else, forging connections at the White House. In November, that would be November 2017, he posted a series of photos to Facebook of him and several friends wearing matching shirts at the White House bowling alley. Weird, right? Just dumb and strange. The Dons, as they call themselves, the Dons hit the lanes at 1600 Pennsylvania, Mr. Patel wrote under the photos. Now, that is actually the conclusion of the article. Weird way to end the article, right? But clearly the writers thought that meant something. That in November of 2017, after bouncing from being counterterrorism prosecutor in Florida and or Texas, and maybe having real credentials, maybe not, bouncing to the Justice Department, to the House Intelligence Committee, and then suddenly, boom, all the way to the White House and the National Security Council. That seems pretty amazing. I mean, that's a meteoric rise if we somehow can see that meteors rise, which they really don't. But think about that. So it goes from 2014, he's in Florida as a public defender. By 2016, he's counterterrorism prosecutor for the Justice Department. By 2017, he has moved on to the Intelligence Committee and is already plotting his move to the White House, where he lands in 2018. That is pretty amazing for a guy from Pace University Law School who may or may not have actual membership in the bar. Just thought I'd throw that out there for you to contemplate. While you're thinking about the news everybody else is finally thinking about. This also from the New York Times. I was taught early on, I learned in my college career, never to rely for your entire thesis on sources, on the New York Times alone. Not because the New York Times had anything wrong with it in particular. We didn't know it at that time. Now we do. But just you want to have a variety of sources. As it happens, all the reporting is from New York Times today. And I think that has to do with the fact that people like to yell at the New York Times for doing a bad job on my Twitter feed, but also there's a good portion that says, yeah, but they do occasionally do some good reporting. And they do. But we won't get into whether or not you should not subscribe now. Today's story, actually yesterday's publication, but today's discussion, Justice Department is said to open criminal inquiry into its own Russia investigation. That's what Bill was talking about. The move is likely to open the Attorney General to accusations that he is trying to deliver a political victory for President Trump. What? Who would accuse him of that? Well, Katie Benner and Adam Goldman would. And they're here to do it. So that's good news. Not the same Katie who wrote the February 2018 profile of Kash Patel, though. That was Katie Rogers. It's getting confusing. I'm wondering whether any of these same people are working on things. And I would really love to get them all together. Let's see. All right. Well, there's a possibility. I guess the common thread here is Adam Goldman. Adam Goldman was on the Wednesday article about Kash Patel being the second back channel on Ukraine. And he links to the old story from February 2018 about Kash Patel. So he's aware of it, if he's the one to put that link in there. And he's on this byline here about the Justice Department opening the criminal investigation. Maybe we'll root for Adam Goldman to put all the dots together here. But for now, what he has is this, along with Katie Benner. For more than 2 years, President Trump has repeatedly attacked the Russia investigation, portraying it as a hoax and illegal, even months after the special counsel closed it. Now, Mr. Trump's own Justice Department has opened a criminal investigation into how it all began. Justice Department officials have shifted an administrative review of the Russia investigation, closely overseen by Attorney General William Barr, to a criminal inquiry, according to two people familiar with the matter. The move now gives prosecutors running it, the prosecutor running it, John H. Durham, there's your name, the power to subpoena for witness testimony and documents, to convene a grand jury, and to file criminal charges. The opening of a criminal investigation is likely to raise alarms that Mr. Trump is using the Justice Department to go after his perceived enemies. He told you he would. Lock her up, right? Mr. Trump fired James Comey, the FBI director under whose watch agents opened the Russia inquiry, and has long assailed other top law enforcement and intelligence officials as partisans who sought to block his election. Mr. Trump has made clear that he sees the typically independent Justice Department as a tool to be wielded against his political enemies. That view factors into the impeachment investigation against him, because it would be an impeachable offense, you see. As does his long obsession with the origins of the Russia inquiry. House Democrats are examining in part whether his pressure on Ukraine to open investigations into theories about the 2016 election constituted an abuse of power. They did. The move also creates an unusual situation in which the Justice Department is conducting a criminal investigation into itself. Mr. Barr's reliance on Mr. Durham, a widely respected and veteran prosecutor who has investigated CIA torture, not very well either, and broken up mafia rings, could help insulate the Attorney General from accusations that he is doing the president's bidding and putting politics above justice. It was not clear what potential crime Mr. Durham is investigating. That's problematic. Nor when the criminal investigation was prompted. A Justice Department spokeswoman declined to comment. Mr. Trump is certain to see the criminal investigation as a vindication of the years he and his allies have spent trying to discredit the Russia investigation. In May, Mr. Trump told the Fox News host Sean Hannity that the FBI officials who opened the case, a counterintelligence investigation, into whether his campaign conspired with Moscow's election sabotage, had committed treason. Wow. Okay. Let me just sort through that again. In May, Trump told Fox News host Hannity that the FBI officials who opened the case had committed treason. Yes, that is what he's saying. We can never allow these treasonous acts to happen to another president, Mr. Trump said. He has called the FBI investigation one of the biggest political scandals in United States history. But he doesn't know anything about United States history, so ignore that. Federal investigators need only a reasonable indication, that's in quotes, that a crime has been committed to open an investigation, a much lower standard than the probable cause required to obtain search warrants. However, there must be an objective, factual basis for initiating the investigation. A mere hunch is insufficient, according to Justice Department guidelines, and you know how important those are, or were, to Mueller anyway. When Mr. Barr appointed Mr. Durham, the United States Attorney in Connecticut, to lead the review, he had only the power to voluntarily question people and examine government files. Mr. Barr expressed skepticism of the Russia investigation even before joining the Trump administration. Weeks after being sworn in this year, he said he intended to scrutinize how it started and used the term spying to describe investigators' surveillance of Trump campaign advisors. But he has been careful to say he wants to determine whether investigators acted lawfully. He's smart enough not to totally give things away right off the bat. The question is whether it was adequately predicated, he told lawmakers in April, and I'm not suggesting that it wasn't adequately predicated, but I need to explore that. In other words, he thinks it's important to look at the paperwork, like I do. Except I'm sane and he's nuts. Mr. Barr began the administrative review of the Russia investigation in May, saying that he had conversations with intelligence and law enforcement officials that led him to believe that the FBI acted improperly, if not unlawfully. The FBI opened the investigation in late July 2016, codenamed Crossfire Hurricane, after receiving information from the Australian government, you remember why, that a Trump campaign advisor, Papadopoulos, had been approached with an offer of stolen emails that could damage Hillary Clinton's campaign. And remember that he got that information from Joseph Mifsud, and Mifsud, according to the BS invented by Kash Patel, I guess, and others, they thought perhaps gotten that information from Italian intelligence officials. Therefore, Barr went to Rome to interview them about that. And the Italians to this day say, no, we had nothing to do with it and we don't know what you're talking about. FBI agents discovered the offer shortly after stolen Democratic emails were released, and the events, along with ties between other Trump advisors and Russia, set off fears that the Trump campaign was conspiring with Russia's interference. The FBI did not use information from the CIA in opening the Russia investigation, former American officials said, but agents' views on Russia's election interference operation, Agents' views on Russia's election interference operation crystallized by mid-August after the CIA, under its director at the time, John Brennan, shared intelligence with Mr. Comey about it. The CIA did contribute heavily to the intelligence community's assessment in early 2017 that Russia interfered in the 2016 election and tried to tip it in Mr. Trump's favor, And law enforcement officials later used those findings to bolster their application for a wiretap on a Trump campaign advisor, Carter Page. The special counsel who took over the Russia investigation in 2017, Mueller, secured convictions or guilty pleas from a handful of Trump associates and indictments of more than 24 Russians on charges related to their wide-ranging interference scheme. In his report, Mueller said that he had insufficient evidence to determine whether Trump or his aides engaged in a criminal conspiracy with the Russians, but that the campaign welcomed the sabotage and expected to benefit from it. Barr is closely managing the Durham investigation, even traveling to Italy to seek help from officials there to run down an unfounded conspiracy that is at the heart of the conservatives' attacks on the Russia investigation. Another thing at the heart, that the Italian government helped set up the Trump campaign advisor who was told in 2016 that the Russians had damaging information that could hurt Clinton's campaign. That is, that they sent Mifsud to give Papadopoulos word that the Russians had emails, and Papadopoulos then got drunk and told the Australians, and the Australians told us. But that's still, it still depends on Papadopoulos being an idiot and a loudmouth and receptive to Russian help, which he was all by himself. But Italy's intelligence services told Mr. Barr that they played no such role in the events leading up to the Russia investigation. Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte of Italy said in a news conference on Wednesday. Mr. Barr has also contacted government officials in Britain and Australia about their roles in the early stages of the Russia investigation. Revelations so far about Mr. Durham's investigation have shown that he is focused in his first months on the accusation that Mr. Trump's conservative allies have made about the origins of the Russia inquiry and their efforts to undermine it. Mr. Durham's efforts have prompted criticism that he and Mr. Barr are trying to deliver the president a political victory, though investigators would typically run down all aspects of a case to complete a review of it. Mr. Durham is running the investigation with a trusted aide, Nora Danahy, and a pair of retired FBI agents. Other prosecutors are also assisting, people familiar with the investigation said. In interviewing more than 24 former and current FBI and intelligence officials, Mr. Durham's investigators have asked about any anti-Trump bias among officials who worked on the Russia investigation and about one aspect of the investigation that was at the heart, another thing at the heart, of highly contentious allegations that they abused their powers, the secret application seeking a court order for the wiretap on Mr. Page. Law enforcement officials suspected Mr. Page was the target of recruitment by the Russian government, which he has denied. Mr. Durham has also asked whether CIA officials might have somehow tricked the FBI into opening the Russia investigation. Mr. Durham has indicated he wants to interview former officials who ran the CIA in 2016, but has yet to question either Mr. Brennan or James Clapper Jr., the former director of national intelligence. Mr. Trump has repeatedly attacked them as part of a vast conspiracy by the so-called deep state to stop him from winning the presidency. Let me just pause here to say what an irony it would be if Durham, who was assigned to investigate CIA torture, ended up declining to prosecute anybody over that, or interviewing former officials in the CIA with respect to either the torture or the destruction of the videotapes of the torture in contravention to a court order. But he is going to find time to get around to interviewing these top leadership of the intelligence community about this. I find that ironic, let's say. Some CIA officials have retained criminal lawyers in anticipation of being interviewed. They didn't have to do that over torture, did they? It was not clear whether Mr. Durham was scrutinizing other former top intelligence officials. Admiral Michael Rogers, the former director of the NSA, declined to say whether he had spoken to Mr. Durham's investigators. Mr. Durham also has yet to question many of the former FBI officials involved in opening the Russia investigation. As Mr. Durham's investigation moves forward, the Justice Department Inspector General is wrapping up his own inquiry into aspects of the FBI's conduct in the early days of the Russia investigation. So they got two going on in case the one doesn't give them the results that they want. Among other things, the Inspector General Michael E. Horowitz is scrutinizing the application for a warrant to wiretap Mr. Page. Wow. Both on the same case. Mr. Barr has not said whether Mr. Durham's investigation grew out of the Inspector General's findings or is something that prosecutors unearthed while doing interviews or reviewing documents. But the Inspector General's findings, which are expected to be made public in the coming weeks, could contribute to the public's understanding of why Mr. Durham might want to investigate national security official activities in 2016. Or it might not. Though the Inspector General's report deals with sensitive information, Horowitz anticipates that little of it will be blacked out, we'll see about that, when he releases the document publicly, he wrote in a letter sent to lawmakers on Thursday and obtained by the New York Times. Mr. Durham has delved before into the secret world of intelligence gathering during the Bush and Obama administrations. He was asked in 2008 to investigate why the CIA destroyed tapes depicting detainees being tortured. The next year, Attorney General Eric Holder appointed Mr. Durham to spearhead an investigation into the CIA abuses. Career prosecutors had already examined many of the same cases and declined to bring charges, and in an echo of the Russia investigation, they fumed that Mr. Holder was revisiting the issue. Interesting. Representative Peter Hoekstra, or it's Hoekstra, isn't it? I always mispronounce that, of Michigan, then the top Republican in the House Intelligence Committee, said that the abuses had been exhaustively reviewed and that a new inquiry could put national security at risk. Where's that excuse now? After nearly 4 years, Mr. Durham's investigations ended with no charges against CIA officers, including 2 directly involved in the deaths of 2 detainees, angering human rights activists. And me. I guess maybe I'm a human rights activist after all. So that's the end of the formal published articles on the subject of this new investigation. But I see this is a topic of conversation for a lot of people. Greg Sargent tweeting this morning says, I'm going to suggest that William Barr's criminal review is actually a telling sign of Trump's mounting rage and panic over the impeachment inquiry. It's easy to see Trump raging at Barr and demanding more protection. Presto, criminal review. And he's got a new piece on that, and to which others have added their own observations. Let me see what Greg's got here. Explosive William Barr news points to Trump's weakness and panic. I think that rather than read through the piece, I think he probably gave us a pretty good indication of what he thinks is going on here, that it's a distraction. But I note that 21 Law on Twitter, who many of you probably follow along, responded with a thread reader app use of Normative's latest, or one of his latest tweet storms. Julian Sanchez, who many of you probably follow as well, who treated it this way. Let me see if I can just run through this sequence again. Thread by Normative, in which 21 Law here calls out this part. This absolutely reeks of a strategic leak. 2 sources say Durham's review has spawned a criminal inquiry, but not when it happened or what the crime is. That's awfully suggestive. And so let me read the thread by Julian Sanchez, Normative, on Twitter before closing things out here. On a second read, he says, this is where this comes from. This absolutely reeks of a strategic leak. 2 sources say Durham's review has spawned a criminal inquiry, but not when it happened or what the crime is. That's awfully suggestive. That in response, that's his reading of the article from the Times that we just read about the opening of the criminal inquiry. Why are 2 officials telling reporters there's a criminal inquiry, but not when or about what? Why that one tidbit of information, but no more? If this were a recent development, wouldn't you at least say that? So, here's my bet. I guess this is in contravention to what Greg is saying. If Greg's thinking this is a recent development, then it's clearly a distraction from or a seeking extra cover due to Trump's increasing nervousness and fright about the progress of the impeachment inquiry. But if it came earlier, we have this. Here's my bet, says Normative. This has been an absolutely abysmal news week for the administration. They very much want to shift the narrative. Okay, maybe he's saying the same thing then. They very much want to shift the narrative back in a more favorable direction. One option, leak just enough information about an old and peripheral development to imply a bombshell. It would, for instance, be pretty unsurprising if the review had, long ago, spawned a criminal probe of some of the clearly unlawful leaks related to the investigation. It'd be more surprising if it hadn't, really. Worth repeating, but not exactly front-page material. But leak one little breadcrumb with no context. So I guess it's his theory and Sargent's that news of the move to a criminal inquiry comes from Trump's team, even though it may not be actual news. Leak one little breadcrumb with no context, leaving the natural implication that this is a new development, and you've got fodder for a speculative feeding frenzy that the deep state coup is about to come crashing down. That's their bread and butter, speaking of breadcrumbs. Ideally, from their perspective, enough of a feeding frenzy to dislodge damaging information coming out of the impeachment depositions from the lead story slot. Obviously, that's all speculative, but it's the only plausible motivation that I can think of for leaking just this one sliver of information to the New York Times at this particular moment, with not even a hint of the what or the when. Possibly a failure of imagination on my part, but for every other set of underlying facts, sources, and motives I can think of, you'd either leak something more or nothing at all. New York Times reporters do at least lampshade the odd specificity of what sources were willing to confirm. It was not clear what potential crime Mr. Durham is investigating, nor when the criminal investigation was prompted. So the too long didn't read summation. This smells like a page 8 that someone wants to make a page 1 for short-term tactical reasons. A real page 1, the incentive for anyone with knowledge is either don't talk to press at all or talk more. But that's a guess, and we'll see soon enough. And I guess the weekend is the time during which we will see. All right, getting towards the end of our time here together. But if you're here and I'm here, isn't that make it our time? Yes, right. So should we get some pizza? Sure, we can. And we can even get them into the skiff if we want to. Let's see. Maybe a good use of the last bit of time here. What do we got here? I got Ken Delanian tweeting this here. Is this related? In a letter, inspectors general, multiple inspectors general, repudiate the DOJ's OLC opinion that the whistleblower's complaint was not an urgent concern. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, it's semi-related, but not directly related to what's going on here. This from the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency. Not even an organization I'm familiar with, but I guess Inspectors General from across government organizations. To Stephen Engel, the Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel. Interesting. And it's a longish letter and small type. So I don't think we're going to get all the way through all of this. I'm not going to be able to enlarge it all that easily. I got to take it out of Twitter and onto the web page application and enlarge it, etc. But interesting. Inspectors General repudiate the OLC opinion that the whistleblower's complaint was not an urgent concern, which was the excuse that Barr used not to, among other things, refer the campaign finance aspect of it to the FEC, although that would be to no avail. But also, I guess, not to, or the DOJ's guidance that led them not to notify Congress initially, which ended up exploding into the impeachment inquiry as a result when everybody found out what was in fact going on with Ukraine. Okay, very interesting. So that's something to keep an eye on as well. And you would also do well, I think, to remind yourself one more time, if you haven't read through the Lawfare article on self-dealing in Ukraine, the core of the impeachment inquiry, which Greg summarized yesterday. The weekend would be a good time for that one. And let me then throw in one more thing here just before we've got to get our music queued up here. But I want to bring this up, and there's a full piece on it from Empty Wheel on her blog, but just by way of teasing you so that you can go and read it in case you missed it. CNN story that we didn't read here buried the lead, though, in their story on Parnas and Fruman yesterday. So I like to keep up with what's happening with them. It turns out that Rudy's grifters were headed to Vienna. Why? I thought possibly to meet with Dmitry Firtash, and that was the original excuse for Parnas, I guess. Although, actually, Degeneva and Tensing said that wasn't why they were heading to Vienna that time. It turns out that Rudy's grifters were headed to Vienna to help Sean Hannity interview the corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor that everyone in Europe wanted to fire. You remember him. And Viktor Shokin was his name, but apparently Hannity was set to interview Shokin, but I guess everything blew up too quickly and he didn't go. But Fruman and Parnas were supposed to go and help him do that. Very odd. The number of odd jobs that such a high roller has, Mr. Parnas in particular, strikes me as awfully odd. Puts him in a lot of places that he shouldn't be. Something else to consider for the weekend. But now, time to consider what's coming up on the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam next. Hey, Matt Gaetz back in the news. He's very, very mad that Jackie Spear referred to him as an entitled white man, but he'll shout you down if you don't treat him like one, so watch out.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Hey, here's a weird one. The Secret Service interviewed Eminem about his anti-Trump lyrics after a Trump bro at TMZ called them up. Criminal arrests of border agents have surged amid the aggressive hiring practices ordered by Trump. And right-wing dark money group Club for Growth accused House Democrats of planning to cancel the 2020 election. Yeah, sure.